Time is short for my presentation, so I'm going to cut to the chase and talk about the question of whether or not drug law reform is less harmful than prohibition, which is the policy that we have in place now and have had for some decades. This is a subject that will touch different people in different ways, but I think it's a very important topic that needs to be addressed by our community, by other communities around the world, and is progressively coming to notice and gaining something of a profile as an area of policy that needs to be reviewed. So I hope that the conversation that happens here today will contribute to that process into the future. I'm going to talk a bit about the existing drug laws, about some of the foundations for those laws, about some of the suggestions that have been made for reform, and probably a few other things too as I go along. But what I will start with is the extent of the problem that we do have, admittedly, in Australia and in other countries around the world with the use of drugs. In the most recent Global Drugs Survey in Australia of 5,849 Australians from all around the country, and this was a survey published by Fairfax Media on the 14th of April last month, so it's very recent. In that survey of 60% male, 40% female, median age of 37, and 84% of the people surveyed in employment. So you can see a pretty good mix, pretty comprehensive survey. It was reported that in the last year before the survey, 97% had taken alcohol, perhaps not surprising, and 80% an illegal drug. Gives you some idea of the way in which ordinary Australians are dealing with drugs. Of the alcohol users, 51% reported potentially harmful use, so excessive ingestion of alcohol, and 40% said that they would like to drink less. And what I want to highlight by that statistic is the fact that alcohol is one of our most serious problems, and probably, in practical terms and in the impact on members of the community, more serious than the use of illegal drugs. Of the drug users, and I'm sorry to give you numbers, but these are the last lot that I'll give you. I don't want to get lost in numbers. But of the drug users, the 80% of those 5,849 people, 35% had used cannabis, which is probably not surprising to you. 23% had used ecstasy, 20% had used cocaine, and 12% amphetamines. Curiously, 5% had used nitrous oxide. Somebody wants to get a laugh out of life. And 4.5%, that is 197 people, reported that they had snorted a white powder without knowing what it was. And that just highlights one of the dangers associated with this kind of what is sometimes called recreational use of drugs. And 32% of the drug users had used codeine, mostly for the purposes of relaxing, not for pain treatment. So an interesting statistic in there is, in the context of Bendigo, I think, is the 12% amphetamine use. Given the prominence that's been given to that drug, methamphetamine, ice, whatever name you give to it, in this district, in recent times, you might be forgiven for thinking that it's used much more across the country. But fashions in drug use change from time to time, from place to place. I'm aware that Last October, a Central Victorian ICE forum was held here. I think, in fact, 2 community fora associated with drugs. And it was nothing to do with ice skating. The Bendigo Advertiser reports on the problem frequently, as I understand it. And police and paramedics bring the problems of dealing with meth's users to public attention, and rightly so. And just as users really don't know what they're ingesting, paramedics also don't know what they're dealing with, and users can react in violent and unpredictable ways under the influence of that drug. Nevertheless, the Advertiser is correct when it says that we can't rely on the legal system to deal with drug users, and jail is not always the right answer. It probably is the right answer for those who profit from drug dealing, and it may be the right answer for repeat offenders, but it's certainly not the right answer for the vast majority of people who do take illicit drugs. We need to be looking at why people use drugs, any drugs, and make efforts like this conversation to educate the community about them. We're discussing a very widespread but essentially practical problem. Nobody is able to offer easy solutions because there aren't any. It's a complex problem, and the issues are different for different drugs in different circumstances. But that shouldn't stop us exploring and trying to find better ways of dealing with the problem. The facts need to be considered and logic applied to them. Practical and realistic solutions need to be found before the problem gets even worse than it is, and the secondary problems from drug use increase even more than they have. We must, in my view, learn to live with drugs. And we can do that, I believe, responsibly. Drug law reform, I think, is indeed much less harmful than prohibition. You may have heard of a group called Australia 21. If you have, the website is www.australia21.org.au. It's the 21 refers to the 21st century, and it's a group of retired senior public servants, professionals, and business people based in Canberra, which looks at a number of topical issues that affect Australians generally. And drugs is one of the issues that they've been looking at. I was involved in the drug project that they ran, and in 2012 they published this report: "The promotion of illicit drugs is killing and criminalising our children, and we are letting it happen," which identified the issues, identified the problem. And then in September 2012, after further consideration, it published this report: "Alternatives to Prohibition. Illicit drugs, how we can stop killing and criminalising young Australians." Now, this is not a bunch of left-wing loonies or potheads. The people involved in this, they're listed in the reports, and you can see, I hope, that they are responsible, sensible people looking at a real problem in the community. I'm not going into that report because it's available publicly, and I'm not going to take precious time this afternoon, dealing with the detail of it. But I do commend those reports to you. I think that they take the conversation a number of steps further than the very valuable suggestions in them. Now, as you've heard, I'm a criminal lawyer. I've practiced in the criminal law in one capacity or another for about 45 years, prosecuting, defending, appearing for people caught up in the criminal justice process in one way or another, and now I am teaching it in retirement from the position of Director of Public Prosecutions. The criminal law is a bit like an undertaker. It comes along after the unpleasant event has happened, tidies up as best it can in ways that are socially acceptable and supported generally by the community, and then it moves on. But the criminal law is not well designed or well equipped to address social problems, much less medical problems that people have. And it's a very blunt instrument, the criminal law. And I can say from years of experience that you do not make a blunt instrument more effective by making it heavier. We're looking for a sharper instrument, an instrument that cuts to the nature of the problems and suggests ways of dealing with it more effectively. Because just bludgeoning the problem with the blunt instruments that we have is not producing any useful outcomes. Whenever I hear talk about sentences being increased and penalties being increased for conduct that we know is going to continue unless the causes of that conduct are addressed, I just say, well, you're whistling in the wind. It's a waste of breath, and it's only going to bring additional harm to the people who are involved in the problem. In our modern times, crimes are created by Parliament, and so our drug laws have been created by Parliament. And they've been created in Australia and in other countries very much in pursuance of 3 international treaties, 3 United Nations instruments. I'm not going again to take time to talk about those because that is easily accessible for anybody. But what it has meant is that, particularly driven by the United States of America, the Western world and other parts of the globe as well have instituted this program of prohibition of certain defined drugs. Some drugs are not prohibited. It's been attempted to prohibit alcohol in various places. In the United States in the 1930s, as you would know, and it was a complete disaster. All it did was to put money into the pockets of criminals, to corrupt public officials, and it did nothing really to reduce the problems that alcohol caused. What it did do was to close down the beer brewing industry for a time, while people ingested illicit spirits, which only made their problems of dealing with alcohol worse than they had been. So that was pretty unproductive. You might be interested to know that we did have prohibition in the Australian Capital Territory in the 1920s under King O'Malley, the American, who was then Minister for the Interior. It was not very successful because Queanbeyan wasn't very far away. And there were indeed a lot of sly grog shops in Canberra during that time. Nevertheless, it followed the American attempt, as we often do, follow American things a bit behind the pace, and it turned out to be just as ineffective as the American attempt had been as well. We do, of course, need criminal laws, and we need penalties or consequences for the breach of those laws. But we really do have to think very carefully whether or not, in relation to the use of chemical and botanical products, there should be criminal sanctions imposed in addition to the harms that are already being caused. The drug laws that we have, I think, rest upon a number of propositions, and I just want to spell them out, if I may. I don't think these specific propositions can be argued against successfully, and when you get to the end of the list, I think there's only one conclusion that really suggests itself, and that is that we are dealing with an issue that won't go away, and we need to deal with it more effectively. So here are the propositions that I would like to put to you. There have always been, and there forever will be, drugs. Substances that alter the mood and the mind when ingested and may have physical effects as well. And that's probably been the case since some ancient human picked up some fermented material, vegetable matter, which by then had contained alcohol, and discovered that it gave a pleasurable sensation. That may have been the beginning of it, I don't know. I might be old, but I'm not that old, I wasn't there. Or when somebody picked up a plant and chewed it and discovered that there was some effect that again was pleasurable, was worth repeating. And since then, of course, we have had a huge number of drugs added to the list. And in the European Union, it's now the case that about 50 or so new drugs, chemically created, are listed on the prohibited drugs lists every year. So the busy little chemists in the back rooms are producing all kinds of things. Secondly, there have always been, and there forever will be, people who want to consume drugs. And the reasons for it are multifarious. Some take drugs to relax, some to heighten their excitement. Some take them to escape, some to engage with their peers. Some take them to aid in contented reflection. Some take them to rave. Some deliberately choose to consume. Some are sucked into it or drift into it under social pressures of one kind or another. And many become addicted. So that's the second proposition. And what you have now is supply and demand. And when you have supply and demand, you have a market. And market price becomes an important consideration which can be affected by supply circumstances and demand circumstances. Now, the market for some drugs and their possession and consumption is unlawful by the actions of government. As I said before, government has learnt the lesson of trying to prohibit alcohol. It hasn't prohibited nicotine, which is also a very dangerous drug, but it has gone some way towards restricting the supply of it, and in the case of both of those drugs, regulating, controlling, and dealing with the consequences of the use of those drugs in an organised way, which is exactly what I would suggest needs to be done with other drugs that we have in circulation as well. Interestingly, caffeine is also a drug, and nobody has bothered to put any restrictions around caffeine other than the normal food laws that apply. But then maybe caffeine has different effects on different people. The people who are involved in the market, because it's for an illegal substance, run a risk of official detection, prosecution and punishment. So it's a risky market to be involved in, either as a supplier or on the demand side. But they choose to run that risk because in the case of suppliers, they're able to reap very high profits from their market activity. And in the case of consumers, their desire for that change of mood that they want from the drugs can't be satisfied elsewhere. So they become engaged in the market for those reasons. And of course, the levels of profit that can be achieved by drug suppliers can be enormous. You can perhaps pick up a kilo of heroin in Bangkok and sell it for $300,000 in Sydney. Pick it up for $1,000 in Bangkok, 300 times markup in Sydney. And similar markups for other kinds of drugs that are brought into the country or manufactured here. Consumers are very often unable to meet the high prices charged from their own resources. So they come looking for yours and for mine. They create secondary crime by stealing property, by getting money to fund their habit. And the suppliers create secondary crime by seeking to corrupt law enforcement and to protect their side of the market from official investigation and ultimately prosecution and punishment. So those are the secondary harms that are done, in addition to the harms that no doubt accompany drug use if it is not carefully controlled and kept within manageable limits. And some drugs can be. There are indeed people who are addicted to heroin who can hold down normal jobs in very responsible positions without any ill effects to themselves or to the organisations that they're serving. They're in the minority, but they do exist. Drugs can be managed. So, what should we be doing? And I think we certainly need to change what we have been doing. Because what we have been doing by the so-called war on drugs, and how you wage war against a botanical or chemical substance, I'm not quite sure, but in the so-called war on drugs that was very cynically created in 1971 by Richard Nixon when his re-election prospects were not looking so good and he needed a diversion, and which we have adopted, has been totally counterproductive. In the time since 1971, the production of drugs in the countries that have waged war on drugs has increased. These statistics are unarguable, I would suggest to you, available and confirmed from very reliable sources. Drug consumption has increased in the time since the war on drugs was declared. The number of types of drugs available has increased and is increasing. As I said, in the European Union alone, 40 or 50 additional drugs are added every year to the prohibited list. The purity of the drugs available has increased across the board. Drugs have become easier to obtain. And the price, again across the board, for all drugs has decreased. And we have spent billions of dollars in Australia and elsewhere in the war on drugs to try to create the exact opposite of those outcomes that are now well established, well documented, and seem to be out of control. So, what should we do? Well, the Australia 21 reports point to a number of specific options in relation to particular drugs. There is no one-size-fits-all. There is no easy answer across the board of drugs because their uses are different, their effects are different, the consequences, the health consequences are different. They have to be dealt with in different ways. But in general terms, my suggestion to you is that all the presently illicit drugs, yes, all the presently illicit drugs, should be regulated, controlled, and taxed. That there should be a system of laws in place that regulate the supply and the distribution and the use of the drugs. And so you would have things like restrictions on juveniles obtaining drugs, as you do with alcohol and nicotine. You would have a series of licensed manufacturers and outlets with licenses that would be very difficult to get and very easy to lose. And so you would have some regulation about the supply and the creation of the drugs. And controlled also by increasing education campaigns, public information, alerting people to the health consequences of the ingestion of particular drugs. as we do now fairly well with nicotine and alcohol, and to some extent with cannabis. And yes, there are potential health consequences with the use of cannabis. Nobody is pretending that every drug is absolutely safe for everybody. That's simply not the case. But driving a car is not absolutely safe for everybody either. And having a drug-free Australia, I think, is about as achievable as having a road accident-free Australia. We need to be realistic, and we need to manage the risk and manage the harm that is done. And finally, taxation. Yes, tax the market and apply the tax revenue to education programs, health programs, treatment programs, to assist those who do become caught up or who want to get off, like some of those survey respondents in that survey that I started with, who really did want to cut down their drinking but didn't seem to be able to find a way of doing it. People in that sort of situation need help. Drug use is a health and social problem. It's not a criminal justice problem. And we need, I believe, to be dealing with it as a health and social problem with an appropriate construct of laws that will restrict the harm and restrict the risks associated with it and bring greater benefits to people in the long term. So thank you very much.